America at the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th was going through a spasm of xenophobia. The anti-immigration sentiments were directed primarily against Chinese, people from the Mediterranean area, blacks from the Caribbean, and Eastern Europeans. Eastern Europeans, of course, was a euphemism for Jews. The majority of those arriving from Eastern Europe were, in fact, Jews. In this session, we want to explore how America reacted to the immigration around 1900, 1910, 1920, and how Jews reacted to what America was doing. First, let's get an idea of how these anti-foreign sentiments were manifest. By 1915, the Ku Klux Klan was experiencing a resurgence. It railed against Jews and Catholics and foreigners and strongly advocated for the so-called Native Americans, in whose vein flowed Anglo-Saxon blood. Of course, today we think of Native Americans as Indians, but in those days the Klan said Native Americans were white Protestants. These Native Americans were, of course, all Anglos. By the 1920s, the lieutenant governor of the state of Indiana had openly connected himself and had run on a platform supported by the KKK. Now, in Russia, halfway around the world, so to speak, there was a revolution. It began in 1905 with an abortive attempt to depose the Tsar. It didn't work very well. And a great fear arose in American circles that anarchists would emigrate from Tsarist lands and bring their radical ideologies over to these shores. And in fact, they did, at least a few of them. The most noted person that you should know about was a woman named Emma Goldman. She was born in 1869 and died in 1940. She came to the U.S. in 1885, fully committed to an anarchist point of view. She championed social revolution, women's liberation, free speech, birth control, and workers' rights. In 1918, during World War I, under the influence of the so-called Red Scare that followed the Bolshevik Revolution, Congress passed the Alien Act. Goldman and 248 other alleged anarchists were deported. She discovered that post-Tsarist Russia was as inhospitable to her ideology as was the U.S. Lenin and his Bolsheviks did not want to be overthrown and deposed any more than the U.S. government. So ultimately she moved to Toronto, Canada, and lived out the rest of her life there. You probably have heard of Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. They were the most famous Americans ever convicted of a crime, at least I think so. They were accused of murder while engaged in a robbery, the proceeds of which were supposedly to be used to subvert the U.S. government. They were anarchists. Even though later evidence cast doubt on their anarchist leanings, it's not clear what they really did believe, because language was a real problem for these two immigrants. They were convicted as dangerous aliens and ultimately executed in 1927 in the electric chair. The Red Scare that consumed much interest during the 1920s and 30s was a hysterical reaction to the fear of communism and political radicalism. Underlying the anxiety about social unrest was the sometimes spoken, but often simply understood, that the nefarious plot was being controlled by an international conspiracy of Jews who dominated the worlds of finance and communication. They owned the banks, they owned the newspapers, allegedly. Much of the fear-mongering depended on a document known as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It alleged that a secret conference of Jewish leaders had gathered and that they had constructed a plan to dominate the world. The first edition of the Protocols appeared in Russia around 1903, but it was soon circulated widely and translated into many languages. Later, it was exposed as a forgery. It was concocted, in fact, by the Russian secret police. But that did not dissuade anti-Semites from believing that it was true. Parenthetically, although the Protocols of the Elders of Zion have long been discredited, it is still read by anti-Jewish and anti-Zionist groups, especially in the Middle East. And you can buy copies of it in Arabic almost everywhere. One person who took the Protocols seriously was Henry Ford, the influential founder of America's automobile industry. In a newspaper Ford controlled called the Dearborn Independent, 91 articles appeared between 1920 and 1922 based on the Protocol's assertion that world Jewry had a plan for global control and domination. These articles were subsequently reprinted for a large leadership in a 4-volume set entitled The International Jew, the World's Foremost Problem. Ford tried to deny direct responsibility for this slander, but his history as someone who was involved with every detail of his operation gives us pause. It suggests otherwise. There's every reason to believe he knew exactly what was going on. Finally, in 1927, a California lawyer named Aaron Shapiro. Now, it's probable that Shapiro was recruited to be the test case by Jacob Schiff in New York, the financier. But we're not sure. It's hard to find out. Anyway, Shapiro sued Ford, and threatened to put him on the stand to read his articles aloud. Uncorroborated tradition has it that Ford did not read very well. He was partially illiterate, perhaps, and that to avoid public embarrassment and censure, he retracted his claims and closed his newspaper. About that same time, President A. Lawrence Lowell of Harvard University was disturbed by the fact that 20% of the undergraduates at Harvard were Jewish. That was way too many for him and for a number of influential alumni. He proposed a quota system limiting Jewish enrollment to 15%. The same idea attracted the leadership of other Ivy League schools. However, the formal quota system fizzled out quickly, though many would assert that an informal numerus clausus, limiting the numbers, prevailed well into the 1940s. Where restrictions did flourish was in private clubs, resorts, hotels, and residential neighborhoods. It is still possible today to find a deed that excludes certain groups from purchasing a house. One time my wife and I bought a house, and in the deed it said that no one of African American descent could buy the property. Now that's illegal today, and in the new deed, of course, it doesn't appear. But they had had that in there for a long time. It's removed today. Finally, in this abbreviated list of bigoted Americans, we ought to mention Father Charles Coughlin, the priest of the Shrine of the Little Flower in Detroit. Father Coughlin was chiefly known through his weekly commentaries on the radio, which included both anti-Semitic and anti-capitalist rhetoric. Following the election of Adolf Hitler as the German Chancellor, Coughlin took a pro-fascist line. His newspaper, which was called Social Justice, argued that a Jewish conspiracy was responsible for the Russian Revolution and for America's Great Depression. The Jews did it. When it became obvious that the German government, the Axis, had become America's enemy, the Bishop of Detroit finally stepped in and silenced Coughlin. He was deemed unpatriotic, but that did not happen until 1942. Notice that stopping him was not based on ethical principles or the incorrectness of his charges, but on pragmatic self-interest. The Catholic Church did not want to be seen as unpatriotic against the war effort. So now, how did Jews react to this whole business? An active difference of opinion developed within the leadership of American Jews. There was no question about the fact that anti-Semitism, whether in the form of quotas, slurs, restrictions, accommodation limits, immigration law, had to be fought. Everybody agreed on that. The real issue revolved around a very simple question. What's the most effective way? How should we do this? As anti-immigration agitation increased during the first decade of the 20th century, the police commissioner of New York City, Theodore Bigham, propounded the notion that a disproportionate amount of crime could be traced to Jewish immigrants. The German Jewish elite of New York City were not willing to take this accusation lying down. It reflected badly on their character and status. In 1906, they founded something called the American Jewish Committee, with the announced purpose of defending Jewish rights against discrimination. They were equally convinced and concerned that the wave of pogroms that had swept through Tsarist lands a year before, in 1905, and that was, not coincidentally, encouraging a spike in Jewish immigration to the United States, would affect them. The American Jewish Committee was led by two of the most prominent Jewish laymen of the time. One of them was Louis Marshall. Louis Marshall was a prominent lawyer who had been born in Upper New York State. He moved to New York. He became affiliated with Temple Emmanuel and served as its president. And he was, by all intents and purposes, a very strong leader. He, at one point, wanted the rabbi to clear his sermons with him before they were given on the pulpit. Marshall was one of the founders of the American Jewish Committee and involved in all kinds of really very good causes, including civil rights and the rights of black Americans. The other man was Jacob Schiff. Jacob Schiff was a German who had come to America and became a merchant banker, an investment capitalist, and was very, very wealthy. On his 70th birthday, he gave away $700,000 to various causes. Schiff was involved in a number of efforts to ease the immigration situation, partly, of course, founding the American Jewish Committee, partly helping establish the Jewish Theological Seminary of America as a religious institution that could cater to immigrant Jews and make their transition into America easier, partly the Galveston Plan, where Jews would be routed away from New York City and brought to Galveston, Texas, and then passed on to various communities in the Midwest and South where they could establish their homes, away from the slums of New York. So if one wanted to define Jewish power in America in 1908 or 1910, and for the 2 decades that followed, it lay, frankly, with these two men, Louis Marshall, Jacob Schiff, and their entourages. But their concept of defending Jewish rights involved a quiet and behind-the-scenes diplomacy. No public dissemination of information, no confrontation, no protest, no parades, no demonstrations. This was the establishment in all its glory, working gingerly to bring a negotiated end to the campaign against Jews. On the other side of the fence was the Antidefamation League, which was founded in 1913, an arm of the Jewish men's fraternal group, the International Order of B'nai B'rith. B'nai B'rith had been founded by 12 German Jewish immigrants in the city of New York in 1843. Its members, led by Henry Jones, whose birth name was probably Heinrich Jonas, but he changed it, declared that both religion and politics were off limits, at least at the founding. They believed that they were divisive and inflammatory issues. In that sense, they complemented each other, the American Jewish Committee with a quiet diplomacy, and the Anti-Defamation League, which took a much more open and confrontational stand. As part of a coordinated national Jewish effort during World War I, they and other groups offered relief to the Jews of Eastern Europe. You see, the Eastern Front of World War I went back and forth across Poland, and that's where millions of Jews lived, and so they were right in the middle of a war zone, and their condition got worse and worse and worse, and so America contrived, American Jews, to send money and food and help to the Jews of Poland and Eastern Europe. They were devastated. So the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee became the central agency for the provision of international relief. After the war, all three of these agencies continued their operations, but now they separated again. They stopped being a coordinated effort. Today they still persist as secular agencies. They are dependent, to be sure, on Jewish religious values and on Jewish ethnic identity. Each is dedicated to the rights and welfare of Jews in the United States, and wherever Jewish rights and liberties are attacked and endangered, but they are separate. America was a little bit different than any other place in the world at this point. What I've described to you is an American Jewish Committee that has no hesitation about standing up for itself, either in the private halls of government, even as far as the president, or in public events, Madison Square Gardens, or out on Fifth Avenue with marches in front of various offices protesting. There was a sense of confidence that American polity, the way America was structured, would permit Jews to take their rights and their liberties seriously and to protect them and fight for them if necessary as much as possible.